wind never really stops in Alaska. It howls and rattles the windows, even when the world outside is frozen solid. That night, the cold felt different, like it was pressing in from every side, squeezing the warmth out of the little cabin. The snow had been falling for hours, thick and heavy, and the only light came from the old oil lamp on the table. I remember the way the shadows moved across the walls, stretching and shrinking as the flame flickered. My brother and I were supposed to be asleep, but neither of us could settle. Every sound outside made us tense up, the groan of the trees, the crack of ice shifting on the river, the distant yelp of a fox. But it was the silence between those noises that made my skin crawl. It was too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. Dad was out checking the traps, and Mom kept glancing at the door, her hands tight around her mug. She tried to act calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The radio had been out for days, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. We were used to being alone, but that night, the loneliness felt sharp, like a warning. I kept thinking about the footprints we'd found that morning. Too big to be a wolf, too deep to be a moose. They circled the cabin, then disappeared into the trees. Dad said it was nothing, just the snow playing tricks, but I saw the way he checked the rifle before he left. The hours dragged on. The lamp hissed. My brother whispered that he thought someone was watching us from the woods. I wanted to tell him he was being silly, but I couldn't. Because I felt it too, something out there, just beyond the edge of the light, waiting. The next morning, the world outside was blinding white. The snow had stopped, but the sky was a flat, heavy gray. Dad still wasn't back. Mom tried to keep us busy, chopping wood, boiling water, checking the food stores, but her voice was too bright, her smile too tight. Every so often, she'd stop and stare out the window, her breath fogging the glass. I watched her fingers tremble as she tied her scarf, and I knew she was scared, even if she wouldn't say it. We found the first sign just after lunch. My brother was stacking kindling by the shed when he called out. There, pressed deep into the snow, were more footprints. They weren't Dad's. These were wider, heavier, and they came right up to the back door before turning away. The prints were fresh, so fresh the edges were still sharp, not softened by wind or sun. Mom's face went pale. She told us to stay inside, but I could see her glancing at the rifle, her lips moving silently as she counted the bullets. That afternoon, the cabin felt smaller, the air thick with worry. My brother kept peeking through the curtains, jumping at every sound. I tried to read, but the words swam on the page. The clock ticked too loud. The floor creaked in places it never had before. Once I thought I heard someone whispering outside, but when I pressed my ear to the wall, there was nothing, just the wind, or maybe something else. As the sun started to set, Mom locked every door and window, double-checking each latch. She made us sit close to the fire, her arms around us, but her eyes kept darting to the shadows. The lamp flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a face at the window, just a pale blur, gone as soon as I blinked. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to scare my brother, but I could feel his hand gripping mine, cold and sweaty. That night, we heard footsteps crunching in the snow. Slow, careful, circling the cabin. Mom held the rifle tight, her finger on the trigger. We sat in the dark, barely breathing, listening as the steps moved from window to window, pausing just long enough to make us wonder if someone was looking in. Then silence. Hours passed. None of us slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints, that pale blur at the glass, and I wondered if we were really alone out here, or if someone was waiting for us to let our guard down. The next night, the fear was a living thing in the room. We barely spoke. Every sound made us flinch. The fire burned low, and the lamp was almost out of oil. Mom sat with the rifle across her knees, her eyes red and tired. My brother and I huddled together, listening to the wind scrape against the walls. Then, just after midnight, we heard it, a sharp, heavy thud against the back door. Not the wind, not an animal. Something, stood up, or someone was out shaking so badly, she almost dropped the gun. She motioned for us to stay behind her. The thudding came again, louder this time, and then a voice, low, rough, almost a growl, called out our names. My stomach twisted. It was Dad's voice, but something was wrong. He sounded strange, slurred, like he was hurt or drunk. Mom hesitated, her face twisted with hope and fear. She called out, asking if it was really him. The voice answered, but it didn't sound right. It was too slow, too careful, like someone trying to remember how to speak. She unlocked the door, just a crack, and that's when the hand shot through, dirty, bleeding, grabbing at her arm. Mom screamed and tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong. My brother started crying, and I froze, watching as the door was shoved open wider. The man who stumbled in looked like Dad, but his eyes were wild, empty, not seeing us at all. His face was twisted with cold and hunger, his clothes torn and soaked with blood. He mumbled our names again, reaching for us, but there was nothing behind his eyes, just a blank, desperate need. Mom raised the rifle, but her hands were shaking too much to aim. The man lunged, knocking her to the floor. I grabbed my brother and ran to the far corner, pressing ourselves against the wall. The room filled with the sound of struggling, the crash of furniture, Mom's sobs, and that awful, broken voice calling out for us, over and over, as if he didn't know who we were anymore. When it was over, the cabin was a mess, broken chairs, shattered glass, blood smeared on the floor. Mom managed to wrestle the rifle away and fire a warning shot into the ceiling. The sound was deafening in the small room. The man, my father, or what was left of him, staggered back, confused, then bolted out into the snow, disappearing into the darkness. We didn't chase him. We just sat there, shaking, listening to the wind and our own ragged breathing. Mom locked the door and pushed a dresser in front of it. She checked us for injuries, her hands cold and clumsy. My brother wouldn't stop crying. I felt empty, like I'd been hollowed out. We didn't sleep. We didn't talk. We just waited for morning, flinching at every sound, afraid he might come back. When the sun finally rose, Mom packed a bag and told us we were leaving. We walked for hours through the snow, not looking back, not saying a word. My legs ached, and my face stung from the cold, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was Dad's eyes, how empty they were, how he didn't seem to know us at all. We never found out what happened to him. Some people said he got lost in the woods, others whispered about things best left alone. But I knew the truth. Sometimes the cold takes more than just your body. It takes your mind too. Even now, years later, I still see that night every time I close my eyes. I remember the way the cold crept into my bones, the way my mother's hands shook as she tried to keep us safe, the way my brother clung to me like I was the only thing left in the world. I don't talk about what happened, not really. People in town ask sometimes, but I just say we lost Dad to the winter like so many others. It's easier than telling them the truth. Easier than admitting that sometimes, the people you trust most can become strangers right in front of you. I still wonder if we could have done something different. If we should have seen the signs sooner, or if there was a moment when we could have saved him. But the truth is, out there in the dark, with the cold pressing in and the world so far away, you start to realize how thin the line is between safety and danger, between family and fear. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, sure I hear footsteps outside the window, or a voice calling my name in the wind. I know it's just my mind playing tricks, but I can't help but listen just in case. The worst part is knowing that the real horror wasn't the cold, or the dark, or even the violence. It was the feeling that no one was ever really coming to help. In the end, we were always alone. The first time I realized something was wrong was the night the generator died. It was late November, and the sun hadn't risen in days. In the mining town of Whittier, the darkness settles in early and never really leaves. I was working the night shift at the old cannery, just me and my supervisor, Mark. The others had gone home for the season, and the place felt abandoned, echoes bouncing off the metal walls, the smell of fish and oil clinging to everything. The only light came from the emergency lanterns, throwing long, shaky shadows across the floor. Mark was in his office, going over paperwork, and I was supposed to be cleaning the machines. But I kept stopping to listen. There was a strange tapping sound, soft but steady, coming from somewhere near the loading dock. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the doors, but it didn't stop, even when the wind died down. I tried to ignore it, but the sound got under my skin, making my scalp prickle. Every time I looked up, I felt like someone was standing just out of sight, watching me from the dark corners of the warehouse. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just the isolation, the endless night, the way the cold seemed to seep into your thoughts. But when I went to check the back door, I found it unlocked. We always kept it bolted, especially at night. My hands started to shake as I slid the bolt back into place. I told Mark, but he just shrugged, said maybe he'd forgotten. But I could see the worry in his eyes, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. That was the moment I knew we weren't alone in the building. Something, or someone was in there with us, and we had no idea what they wanted. After I locked the back door, I tried to get back to work, but my nerves were shot. Every clang of metal made me jump. Mark came out of his office, rubbing his arms, and asked if I'd seen anyone outside. I shook my head, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He kept peering into the shadows, his face tight and pale. The tapping sound started up again, this time closer, like it was coming from inside the walls. We both heard it. Mark tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. We decided to check the building together. The cannery was huge, with long, empty corridors and rooms filled with old equipment. Our footsteps echoed as we walked, flashlights cutting through the dark. In the break room, we found a mug of coffee still warm, sitting on the table. Neither of us had made it. Mark's hand shook as he picked it up, and he set it down quickly, like it burned him. We checked the windows. One was cracked open, letting in a thin line of freezing air. Mark swore under his breath and slammed it shut. As we moved through the building, I started to notice little things that were off. A chair pulled out in the locker room, a set of muddy footprints leading down the hall, a half-eaten sandwich on a workbench. It was like someone had been living there, moving from room to room, just out of sight. Mark tried to call the police, but the radio was dead. The phone lines had been down for weeks. We were cut off. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to follow us, always just ahead or behind. At one point, we heard a door slam at the far end of the building. Mark wanted to go check it out, but I grabbed his arm and begged him not to. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I kept thinking about the stories I'd heard, about drifters sneaking into empty buildings, about people disappearing in the night, never found. We decided to stick together, but the fear was getting to us. Mark started snapping at me, accusing me of leaving the door open, of playing tricks. I tried to defend myself, but my voice sounded small and weak. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. Every time I turned around, I expected to see someone standing there, just out of reach. The cold felt sharper, the darkness heavier. I realized then that it wasn't just the two of us in the building. Someone else was there, and they were getting bolder. We were almost finished checking the last storage room when the lights flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. My flashlight shook in my hand as I swept the beam across the walls, catching only empty shelves and piles of crates. Mark whispered that we should head back to the office and lock ourselves in until morning, but as we turned to leave, the tapping started again. This time right behind the door we'd just closed. Mark reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, the door rattled hard, like someone was trying to force it open. We both froze. The tapping turned into pounding, and then a voice, low, hoarse, almost pleading, called out from the other side. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it sounded desperate, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. Mark shouted back, asking who it was, but the only answer was a long, scraping sound, like fingernails dragging down the metal. Suddenly, the door burst open, slamming Mark against the wall. A man stumbled in, wild-eyed, filthy, his clothes torn and soaked from the snow. He looked half-starved, his face gaunt and hollow. He stared at us, breathing hard, and for a moment, no one moved. Then he lunged at Mark, grabbing him by the collar and screaming something I couldn't understand. Mark fought back, but the man was stronger than he looked, driven by something I couldn't name, the man off, hunger, but he swung at me, catching me across the cheek. I fell back, dazed, as Mark and the stranger crashed into the shelves, sending boxes tumbling to the floor. The man kept shouting, his words slurred and broken, and I realized he wasn't making sense, just repeating the same phrase over and over, begging for help, for food, for warmth. The fight seemed to last forever, but finally, Mark managed to shove him away, and the man collapsed, sobbing, onto the cold concrete. The room was a mess, boxes everywhere, the stranger curled up on the floor, shaking and crying. Mark was bleeding from his lip, his shirt torn, his hands trembling as he backed away. I pressed my hand to my cheek, feeling the sting where I'd been hit, but I couldn't look away from the man on the ground. He kept mumbling, rocking back and forth, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. I wanted to help him, but I was too scared to get close. Mark grabbed the radio again, but it was still dead. He swore and kicked a crate, then told me to keep an eye on the man while he went to find something to tie him up with. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The stranger didn't try to get up. He just kept whispering, so cold, so hungry, over and over, his voice barely more than a breath. We waited like that for what felt like hours, the three of us trapped in that freezing room, the only sound the stranger's broken voice and the wind howling outside. When Mark came back, he tied the man's hands with an old rope and dragged him to a corner. We sat together, backs against the wall, watching the stranger shiver and cry, not knowing what else to do. The fear didn't go away. If anything, it grew heavier, settling over us like another layer of cold. We made it through the night, but nothing felt right after that. When the sun finally rose, Mark and I took the stranger outside and waited for help. It took hours before anyone came. When the police finally arrived, they barely looked at us before taking the man away. They said he was a drifter, probably lost in the woods for days, maybe weeks. He'd broken in looking for food and shelter, desperate enough to do anything. They told us we were lucky he hadn't done worse. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow, like something important had been scraped out of me. I kept thinking about the way the man had looked at us, like we were the last hope he had, and we'd just watched him fall apart. Mark quit a few days later. I stayed, but I never worked another night shift alone. Every time the wind rattled the doors, I'd remember that voice, begging for warmth, for help, and how quickly fear can turn people into strangers. Sometimes I wonder what happened to him, if he ever found his way back to himself, or if he just disappeared into the cold like so many others. The truth is, out here, you learn how thin the line is between being safe and being desperate, and you realize how easy it is to look away, to pretend you're not afraid, even when you are. The cold doesn't just freeze your skin, it gets inside you, and it never really leaves. The first time I felt truly alone was the winter I worked at the remote weather station outside Nome. The place was nothing more than a squat building surrounded by endless white, miles from the nearest road. There were only 3 of us, me, a guy named Eric, and our supervisor, Linda. We rotated shifts, logging data, checking instruments, and trying not to go stir-crazy. The days blurred together, the sun barely skimming the horizon before sinking back into darkness. The silence was so deep it felt like a weight pressing on my chest. One night, I was on the late shift, sitting in the control room with the radio crackling static. Eric was asleep in the bunk room, and Linda was supposed to be out checking the wind gauges. I remember glancing at the clock, 2:17 a.m., and feeling a strange sense of unease. Linda had been gone too long. I tried to radio her, but all I got was more static. I told myself she'd just lost track of time, but the longer I waited, the more the silence started to feel wrong. I went to the window and looked out. The snow was falling hard, swirling in the wind, but I could just make out a set of footprints leading away from the building. They didn't go toward the gauges. They wandered off at an angle, disappearing into the darkness. My heart started to race. I thought about waking Eric, but something stopped me. I stood there, staring into the night, feeling like the world had shrunk down to just me and the storm. That was when I realized how easy it would be to disappear out here, how quickly someone could vanish, and no one would ever know why. I pulled on my parka and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap, sharp and immediate, stealing the breath from my lungs. The wind howled around the building, and the snow stung my face. I followed the footprints, my boots crunching in the fresh powder. The beam of my flashlight bounced over the drifts, but I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The tracks wandered, looping and doubling back, as if Linda had been lost or confused. I called her name, but the wind swallowed my voice. The footprints led me past the edge of the station's lights, out into the open tundra. I hesitated, glancing back at the building, its windows glowing warm and yellow in the distance. For a moment, I thought about turning back, but something in me wouldn't let go. I kept walking, my heart pounding, every step taking me further from safety. After a few minutes, I found something half buried in the snow, a glove, bright red against the white. I picked it up, my fingers numb, and looked around. The tracks were getting harder to see, filling in with new snow. I started to panic, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I called Linda's name again, louder this time, but there was no answer. Just the wind and the endless dark. I turned to head back, but the snow was falling so hard now that I couldn't see the station. For a few terrifying seconds, I spun in circles, trying to find the lights. My mind raced with thoughts of getting lost, freezing to death just a few hundred yards from shelter. I forced myself to calm down, to follow my own footprints back. When I finally stumbled inside, shaking and half frozen, Eric was waiting for me, his face pale and scared. He said he'd heard someone knocking on the door while I was gone, but when he looked outside, there was no one there. Just the wind and the snow. We waited for Linda, but she didn't come back. The radio stayed silent. We searched again at first light, but the tracks were gone, wiped clean by the storm. All we found was that single red glove, lying in the snow like a warning. The silence in the station grew heavier, and every time the wind rattled the windows, I wondered if Linda was still out there, lost and alone, or if something else had found her first. The next night, neither of us slept. We kept the lights on and the doors locked, jumping at every sound. Eric paced the halls, muttering to himself, while I sat by the radio, listening to the static and hoping for Linda's voice. Around midnight, the generator sputtered and the lights flickered. I felt a wave of panic, remembering how quickly the darkness could swallow everything out here. Then, just as I was about to check the fuel, we heard it, a slow, steady knocking at the back door. Not frantic, not hurried. Just 3 knocks, then silence. Eric and I stared at each other, neither of us moving. The knocking came again, a little louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight and crept down the hall, Eric close behind me. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the light steady. When I reached the door, I pressed my ear against it. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard a voice, soft, almost pleading, calling my name. It sounded like Linda, but her voice was thin, stretched by the wind. I wanted to open the door, but something in me hesitated. Eric whispered that it couldn't be her, that no one could survive out there for so long in that cold. I tried to convince myself he was wrong, but the fear in his eyes. I stood there, frozen, listening to the wind howl outside. I never opened the door. I couldn't. The next morning, we found more footprints in the snow, circling the building, stopping at every window and door. They were smaller than mine or Eric's, and they disappeared into the white, just like Linda's had. That was the moment I realized how quickly trust can turn to doubt, and how, in the dark and the cold, you can never really be sure who's on the other side. After that night, the station felt different. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made us jump. Eric barely spoke. He just sat by the window, staring out at the endless snow, flinching whenever the wind picked up. I tried to keep busy, logging data, checking the equipment, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The radio stayed silent, and the days dragged on, each one colder and darker than the last. We never found Linda. The search teams came when the storm finally broke, but there was nothing left. No tracks, no sign of her, just that red glove and the memory of her voice at the door. The official report said she must have gotten lost in the storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had happened. Something we couldn't explain. Eric left as soon as the supply plane arrived. He didn't say goodbye. I stayed behind to finish out the season, but I never slept through the night again. Every time the wind rattled the doors, I remembered those knocks, that voice calling my name, and the way fear can make you doubt everything, even the people you trust most. The silence in the station was no longer peaceful. It was a warning. I still think about Linda, about the footprints in the snow, and the voice at the door. Sometimes I wonder if I should have opened it, if maybe she was really out there, needing help. But then I remember the way Eric looked at me, the terror in his eyes, and I know I couldn't have done it. Out there in the endless dark, you start to question everything. Your own memory, your instincts, even your sense of right and wrong. The cold changes people. It makes you see things that aren't there, or maybe it just strips away the things you want to believe. I used to think I was strong, that I could handle anything Alaska threw at me. But after that winter, I realized how thin the line is between safety and danger, between trust and suspicion. Sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what's out there in the snow. It's what happens to you when you're left alone with your fear. I left the station when my contract ended. I never went back. But every winter, when the nights get long and the wind starts to howl, I hear those knocks in my dreams. I wake up cold, heart pounding, listening for a voice that sounds almost familiar, and I wonder if I'd have the courage to open the door, or if I'd just stand there frozen, waiting for the silence to swallow me whole. The first time I realized something was wrong with the town was the day I moved into the teacher's cabin. It was late August, and the sun still hung low in the sky, never quite setting, never quite rising. The village was small, just a handful of houses, a school, and a store, all huddled together on the edge of the tundra. I'd come up from Anchorage, thinking I was ready for the quiet, for the long winter nights, and the close-knit community. But from the start, something felt off. The locals were polite, but distant. They watched me with careful eyes, their conversations stopping whenever I walked by. The kids in my class were quiet, too, their faces blank, their voices barely above a whisper. At first, I thought it was just shyness, or maybe the newness of having an outsider in their world. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Every time I looked out the window, I'd see someone standing just at the edge of the schoolyard, half hidden by the trees, staring at the building. When I waved, they'd turn and walk away. The nights were the worst. The wind would pick up, rattling the windows and making the walls creak. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, slow and steady, pausing right by my door. I'd lie in bed, holding my breath, waiting for the sound to fade. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a stray dog, but deep down I knew it was something else. Something about the way the whole town seemed to hold its breath whenever I asked questions, the way the kids flinched when I mentioned the woods, made me feel like I was missing something important, something everyone else already knew. The days grew shorter, and the air turned sharp. I tried to settle in, focusing on my students and the lesson plans, but the sense of being an outsider never faded. The kids avoided eye contact, and their drawings were always the same: dark forests, empty houses, stick figures standing alone. When I asked about their families or what they did for fun, they'd just shrug or look away. The other teachers kept to themselves, leaving early and locking their doors behind them. I started to feel like I was the only one who didn't know the rules. One afternoon, I stayed late to grade papers. The school was empty, the halls echoing with every step. As I packed up to leave, I noticed a small notebook left behind on a desk. It belonged to one of my quietest students, a girl named Ava. I flipped through it, expecting to see math problems or spelling words, but instead, every page was filled with the same sentence, written over and over. "Don't go into the woods." The handwriting grew messier, the words slanting off the page, as if she'd been writing in a hurry. That night, I heard footsteps again, closer this time. I peeked through the curtains and saw a group of people standing in the street, their faces hidden in the shadows. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching my cabin. I called the village office, but no one answered. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the next morning, I found muddy footprints on my porch, leading right up to my door and then back toward the woods. I started asking questions at school, but the other teachers brushed me off. "It's just the way things are here," one of them said, her eyes darting to the window. "Don't worry about it." The kids grew even quieter, and Ava stopped coming to class altogether. When I asked about her, the principal just shook his head and told me to focus on my work. The sense of isolation grew heavier. I felt watched everywhere I went, at the store, on the path to school, even inside my own cabin. The townspeople's smiles felt forced, their greetings hollow. I started locking my doors and windows, double-checking them before bed. But every night, the footsteps returned, circling my cabin, pausing just outside, as if waiting for me to make a mistake. The message in Ava's notebook echoed in my mind, and I began to wonder what would happen if I ignored it. It was a Friday night when I finally broke. The footsteps were louder than ever, and the feeling of being watched was so strong I couldn't breathe. I sat in the dark, clutching a flashlight, listening as someone, or several people, moved around my cabin. Then, just after midnight, there was a soft knock at the door. Not urgent, just steady, like whoever was out there knew I was awake. I crept to the window and peeked out. Ava was standing on my porch, barefoot in the snow, her hair tangled, her eyes wide and shining in the beam of my flashlight. She didn't say anything, just stared at me through the glass. I opened the door a crack, my heart pounding. She whispered, "Don't let them in," and glanced over her shoulder at the darkness behind her. Before I could ask what she meant, I saw movement in the trees, shapes shifting between the trunks, too many to count. Faces I recognized from the village, all watching, all silent. Ava pressed something cold and small into my hand, a key, old and rusted. "Lock the door," she said, her voice shaking. She ran off into the night. "Don't open it," before I could stop her, disappearing into the woods. The people in the trees started to move closer, their footsteps crunching in the snow, their eyes fixed on my cabin. I slammed the door and locked it with the key, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. The next hour was a blur of pounding on the walls, voices whispering my name, shadows passing by the windows. I sat on the floor, back against the door, every muscle tense, waiting for the lock to give way. I realized then that I was completely alone, and whatever was happening in that town, I was never meant to understand it. When the sun finally rose, the world outside was silent. The snow was untouched except for a single set of small footprints leading away from my porch and into the woods. Ava's, I guessed. The rest of the village looked the same as always, but I could feel the difference. People avoided my eyes even more, their faces closed off, their voices flat. No one mentioned the night before. No one asked if I was okay. Ava never came back to school. Her desk stayed empty, her name never spoken. When I asked about her, the principal just shook his head and told me to let it go. The other teachers wouldn't meet my gaze. I tried to talk to the police, but they just told me kids run off sometimes, especially in the winter. I knew they were lying, or at least hiding something, but I was too tired to push anymore. I started keeping the key with me at all times, checking the lock every night. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched never really left. I went through the motions at school, but I felt like a ghost, drifting through a place that had already decided I didn't belong. The message in Ava's notebook haunted me. Don't go into the woods. I never did. I didn't need another warning. I left the village as soon as the school year ended. I packed my things in silence, not saying goodbye to anyone. No one tried to stop me. On the flight back to Anchorage, I kept the old key in my pocket, turning it over and over in my hand, wondering what it really unlocked. Sometimes I think about Ava, about her bare feet in the snow and the fear in her eyes. I wonder if she ever made it out, or if she just became another secret the town kept hidden. The strangest part is how normal everything looked in the daylight. Just a quiet village, kids playing, people going about their lives. But I know now that some places have rules you'll never understand, and if you don't belong, you're always on the outside, no matter how hard you try. I still dream about that night sometimes, the faces in the trees, the voices at my door, the feeling that everyone around me was in on something I could never be part of. I don't tell people about what happened. They wouldn't believe me, or they'd just say I let the darkness get to me. Maybe they're right, but I still keep the key, and I still wake up some nights, sure I hear footsteps outside my door. I remind myself not to look, not to ask questions, and above all, not to go into the woods. Some warnings are meant to be followed, even if you never understand why. The first time I realized how far people would go to protect themselves was the winter I worked as a nurse in a tiny Alaskan fishing village. The clinic was just a single room, tucked between the docks and a row of battered houses. Most days were quiet, treating frostbite, patching up cuts, handing out painkillers. But that year, the ice came early, trapping everyone in town. The supply boat couldn't get through, and the roads were buried under snowdrifts taller than a man. We were cut off, and everyone knew it. At first, people tried to keep things normal. The fishermen played cards in the store, the kids built snow forts, and the elders told stories by the fire. But as the days dragged on, and the food started to run low, the mood changed. People stopped talking to each other. They locked their doors, even during the day. I started seeing more injuries, fights over canned goods, broken windows, bruises that no one wanted to explain. One night, I was closing up the clinic when I heard shouting outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw a group of men dragging someone down the street, their faces hidden by scarves and hoods. The person they were dragging was struggling, but no one stepped in to help. The snow muffled everything, turning the scene into a silent nightmare. I wanted to call for help, but the phone lines were dead, and I knew no one would come. That was the moment I realized how quickly a community can turn on itself when survival is on the line. After that night, the village felt different. People avoided each other, and no one spoke about what had happened. The next morning, I asked around about the man I'd seen dragged through the snow, but everyone just shook their heads or changed the subject. Even the patients who came in for bandages or medicine wouldn't meet my eyes. The silence was heavy, like everyone was waiting for something worse. I started noticing little things that made my skin crawl. The store owner, who used to greet me every morning, now kept the door locked and only let people in one at a time. The fishermen stopped gathering at the docks, and the kids disappeared from the streets. At night, I'd hear footsteps crunching outside my window, sometimes stopping right beneath it. Once, I found a bloody handprint on the clinic's back door, half melted by the morning sun. One evening, a woman named Ruth came to the clinic with a deep cut on her arm. She was shaking, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. I tried to ask what happened, but she just whispered, "Don't trust anyone," and begged me not to tell anyone she'd been there. As I stitched her up, she told me in a trembling voice that people were being blamed for the missing food, that the village council had started making lists of who was taking more than their share. She said the man I'd seen dragged away was accused of stealing, but she didn't know what happened to him after that. The next day, I found a note slipped under the clinic door. It was just a scrap of paper with a single word: leave. My hands shook as I read it. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but the fear in Ruth's eyes and the silence in the village told me otherwise. I started sleeping with a chair wedged under the doorknob, jumping at every sound. The tension kept building. People started coming to the clinic with injuries they wouldn't explain: split lips, bruised ribs, broken fingers. I heard rumors of secret meetings at night, of people being watched, of names being crossed off lists. The sense of community was gone, replaced by suspicion and fear. I realized then that the real danger wasn't the cold or the hunger. It was what people were willing to do to each other when they thought no one was watching. It all came to a head one night when someone pounded on the clinic door, loud and desperate. I opened it just a crack and saw Ruth, her face streaked with tears, clutching a bundle to her chest. She begged me to let her in, whispering that they were coming for her next. I pulled her inside and locked the door, my heart racing. She kept glancing at the windows, flinching at every sound. A few minutes later, I heard voices outside, angry, slurred, and getting closer. Shadows moved past the frosted glass, and someone started banging on the door, demanding I hand Ruth over. They shouted that she was a thief, that she was the reason their children were hungry. I tried to reason with them, but they wouldn't listen. The banging grew louder, the voices more frantic. Ruth sobbed, begging me not to let them take her. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a heavy metal flashlight, and stood between Ruth and the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The door rattled on its hinges, and for a moment, I thought it would break. I could see the fear in Ruth's eyes, the way she shrank into the corner, clutching her bundle like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Then just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The shadows moved away from the window, the voices faded into the night. I waited, barely breathing, until I was sure they were gone. Ruth collapsed onto the floor, sobbing with relief. I sat down beside her, my whole body trembling, realizing how close we'd come to something irreversible. At that moment, I understood that the real horror wasn't outside in the snow. It was right there in the room with us, in the fear and desperation that had taken over everyone I thought I knew. After that night, Ruth stayed hidden in the clinic, sleeping on a cot in the supply room. I brought her food when I could, but I knew it wasn't safe for either of us. The village grew even quieter, the air thick with suspicion. People stopped coming to the clinic unless it was an emergency, and when they did, they barely spoke. I caught them glancing at the closed door to the supply room, their eyes cold and searching. I tried to keep Ruth's presence a secret, but I could feel the pressure building. Every time someone knocked on the door, my heart jumped into my throat. I started to wonder if I was being watched, if someone would turn me in just to save themselves. The fear was constant, a dull ache in my chest. Find another note slipped under the door. This one was longer, the handwriting shaky. "We know she's there. If you don't send her out, you'll both pay." I showed it to Ruth, and she just nodded, her face pale and resigned. We both knew what it meant. The village had made up its mind. There was no one left to trust, not even each other. The only thing left was to wait and hope the ice would break before the people did. When the thaw finally came and the supply boat pushed through the ice, I left the village without saying goodbye. Ruth was gone by then. She slipped out one night while I was sleeping, leaving nothing behind but her empty cot and a thank you scrawled on a scrap of gauze. I never saw her again. The villagers watched me pack my things, their faces blank, their eyes following me until I was out of sight. No one spoke. No one offered help. Back in the city, people asked what it was like to live so far north, if the cold or the darkness ever got to me. I always said it was the isolation that was hardest, but that wasn't the truth. The real horror was seeing how quickly fear could turn neighbors into enemies, how suspicion could eat away at kindness until there was nothing left but survival. I still think about Ruth, about the man dragged through the snow, about the notes slipped under my door. Sometimes I wonder if I could have done more, or if I was just another part of the silence that let it all happen. Now, whenever I hear the wind howling outside, I remember those nights in the clinic, the locked doors, the whispered threats, the feeling that help was never coming. In some places, the cold never really leaves you. It just settles in, quiet and patient, waiting for the next time people are left alone with their fear. I never thought much about the highway until I started driving it alone. The stretch between Fairbanks and Deadhorse is hundreds of miles of nothing, just snow, ice, and the endless, empty road. I was hauling supplies for a construction crew, making the trip every week, sometimes in the middle of the night when the sky was so dark it felt like the world had ended. The radio barely worked, and the only company was the hum of the engine and the crunch of tires on frozen gravel. One night, the temperature dropped so low the dashboard lights flickered. I was hours from the nearest town, the road ahead swallowed by darkness. I kept my eyes on the yellow lines, trying not to think about how easy it would be to slide off into a ditch and disappear. That's when I saw the headlights behind me, just a single pair far back, but getting closer. I hadn't seen another car in hours. At first, I was relieved. Out here, even a stranger felt like a lifeline. But the headlights didn't pass. They stayed just behind me, matching my speed, never getting closer, never falling back. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just another trucker keeping pace. But every time I glanced in the mirror, the lights were there, steady and silent, following me through every curve and stretch of empty road. The longer it went on, the more I felt the hair on my neck stand up. I started to wonder if I was really alone out there, or if someone was waiting for me to make a mistake. I kept driving, my hands tight on the wheel, eyes flicking between the road and the mirror. The headlights never wavered. I tried slowing down, hoping the car would pass, but it just slowed with me, always keeping the same distance. I sped up, pushing the truck faster than I should have on the icy road, but the lights stayed right behind, never gaining, never falling away. My heart thudded in my chest, and I started to sweat, even though the cab was freezing. I tried the radio, hoping to catch a voice, any voice, but all I got was static. I thought about pulling over, but the idea of stopping in the middle of nowhere, with no one around for miles, made my skin crawl. I kept telling myself it was just another driver, maybe someone as nervous as I was, but the longer it went on, the less I believed it. The road signs blurred past, and the darkness pressed in from every side. After an hour, I started to see things out of the corner of my eye, shapes moving in the snow, shadows that didn't belong. I told myself it was just exhaustion, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I passed a rest stop, a single flickering light over a frozen picnic table, and thought about pulling in, but the headlights followed, slowing as I slowed, never passing, never leaving. I called out into the night, hoping for a response, but there was nothing but the hum of the engine and the crunch of tires. I tried to remember if I'd seen the car before, if maybe it was someone from the crew, but the shape was wrong, too low, too old, not one of the trucks or pickups I was used to seeing. I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake somewhere, if I'd cut someone off or missed a signal, but I couldn't remember anything. My eyes burned from staring at the mirror, waiting for the lights to make a move. I started to feel trapped, boxed in by the darkness and the silent, unblinking headlights. Every time I thought about stopping, I pictured someone getting out of that car, walking up to my window, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I realized then that out here, on this empty road, no one would hear me if something went wrong. And whoever was behind me knew it too. I finally couldn't take it anymore. My nerves were shot, my hands aching from gripping the wheel. I spotted a wide pull-off just ahead, a place where the snowplows turned around, empty except for a battered sign half buried in snow. I made a split-second decision and jerked the truck off the road, slamming on the brakes. The headlights behind me slowed, then stopped at the edge of the pull-off, still pointed straight at my back window. I sat there, engine idling, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. The other car didn't move. No one got out. The lights just stayed there, burning into the darkness, making it impossible to see who was inside. I waited, counting the seconds, trying to decide if I should get out or just drive away. The silence was thick, broken only by the ticking of the engine and the wind rattling the cab. Then slowly, the headlights started to move. The car crept forward, inching closer to my truck. I could see the outline now, an old sedan, paint peeling, windows fogged. It stopped just a few feet behind me. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal, just the empty bars mocking me. I thought about honking, flashing my lights, anything to break the tension, but I was frozen, trapped by the fear of what might happen next. Suddenly, the driver's door opened. A figure stepped out, bundled in a heavy coat, face hidden by a hood. They stood there for a moment, staring at my truck, then turned and walked into the darkness, away from the road, leaving the car running and the headlights shining. I watched, breathless, as the figure disappeared into the snow. The car stayed there, engine humming, lights burning holes in the night. I realized then that whatever game was being played, I was never meant to understand the rules. Out here, on this empty highway, I was completely alone. I sat in my truck for what felt like hours, staring at the empty car and the trail of footprints leading off into the darkness. My mind raced with questions. Who was that person? Why had they followed me for so long? And where were they going in the middle of nowhere? I wanted to get out, to check the car, to see if maybe someone needed help, but I couldn't make myself move. The fear was too heavy, pinning me to the seat. Eventually, I forced myself to start the engine and pull back onto the road. As I drove past the abandoned sedan, I glanced inside. The windows were fogged, but I could just make out the shape of something on the passenger seat. A pile of clothes, maybe, or a blanket. I didn't stop to look closer. I just kept driving, watching the headlights fade in my mirror until they were swallowed by the night. The rest of the trip was a blur. Every time I saw headlights behind me, my heart jumped into my throat. But no one followed me again. When I finally reached the camp, I told myself it was over, that it was just a strange encounter on a lonely road. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never really left. Even now, I still check my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights appear out of the darkness, steady and silent, waiting for me to be alone again. I never found out who was in that car, or why they followed me for so many miles. No one at the camp believed my story. They just laughed and said the highway does strange things to your mind when you're tired and alone. Maybe they were right. But sometimes late at night, I still see those headlights in my dreams, always just behind me, never passing, never leaving. I think about how easy it is to disappear out there, how quickly the world can forget you when you're just another set of taillights swallowed by the dark. I used to think the scariest part of Alaska was the cold or the endless miles of empty road. Now I know it's the silence, the way it makes you doubt what you saw, what you felt, even your own memory. It's the way you realize out there that help is never close, and sometimes the only thing watching you is someone who doesn't want to be seen. I still drive that highway sometimes, but I never travel at night anymore. I keep my doors locked, my eyes on the road, and my mind on the next patch of light. But every so often, when the sky is black and the road is empty, I catch a glimpse of headlights in my mirror, and I wonder if it's all starting again. Out here, you learn that the real danger isn't what you see. It's what you can't explain, and what you hope never finds you.